The heat in the Arizona territory was not simply a temperature. It was a physical weight, a heavy woolen blanket pressed against the skin that made the simple act of breathing a labor. It was late August of the year 1884, and the stagecoach rattled across the hard-packed earth like a beetle scurrying across a hot skillet. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale tobacco, and the pervasive metallic tang of red dust that coated everything. Lydia Monroe sat near the window, her spine pressed straight against the cracked leather seat. At 24 years of age, she possessed a posture that the finishing schools of Boston had failed to break, though not for lack of trying. She adjusted the brim of her hat, pulling it lower to shield her eyes from the glare that sliced through the open window. On her lap, clutched with possessive tightness, was a leather case containing her most improved dry plate camera and a supply of glass negatives. To the other passengers, it was likely just luggage. To Lydia, it was her shield, her weapon, and her only ticket away from a life of suffocating domesticity. "You look pale, Miss Monroe," a voice said from the opposite bench. "Perhaps the heat is too much for a lady of your constitution." Lydia turned her gaze from the endless horizon of sagebrush and mesmer to look at Lieutenant James Wyatt. He was handsome in the conventional way that society matrons adored, with a square jaw and blonde hair that he kept meticulously groomed. Even here at the edge of the civilized world, he had pursued her in Boston with flowers and poetry. And now, having transferred to the frontier for glory, he seemed to view her presence here as merely an extension of their courtship, a whimsical adventure she would surely tire of before the month was out. "My constitution is quite durable, Lieutenant," Lydia replied, her voice cool. "And I am here to work, not to swoon." The readers of the Morning Chronicle expect a vivid account of the railway expansion, and I intend to provide it along with photographs that tell the truth of this place. James offered a condescending smile that made Lydia's fingers tighten around her camera case. "The truth is a harsh thing out here. Lydia, this is not a park in Cambridge. It is a wild country, savage country. Colonel Barrett has his hands full just keeping the peace so that honest men like Silas Crowley can bring progress to these territories." At the mention of Silas Crowley, the merchant sitting beside James nodded vigorously. He was a round man who sweated profusely, his handkerchief already stained yellow. "A great man, Mr. Crowley. That railway line through the canyon is going to open up trade routes that will make us all rich. If only the government would deal with the Apache problem once and for all." Lydia turned back to the window. She knew the names well. Colonel Nathan Barrett was the commander of the local fort, a man whose reputation for maintaining order was shadowed by rumors of brutality. Silas Crowley was the railroad tycoon financing the expansion, a man who viewed the mountains and valleys not as nature, but as obstacles to be blasted apart with dynamite. The coach lurched violently as it hit a rut, throwing the passengers against one another. The widow, a sour-faced woman in black bombazine who had not spoken a word since Santa Fe, gasped and clutched her rosary. The gambler, a man with slippery eyes and a suit that had seen better days, merely smirked and tipped his hat. Beside him, a young boy, no older than 12, looked out at the desert with wide, terrified eyes, clutching a canvas bag of mail as if it contained gold bullion. Lydia felt a sudden, fierce pang of isolation. She had come here to prove that she was more than just a pretty ornament to be placed on a husband's shelf. She had fled an arranged marriage to a wealthy banker, a man twice her age, who viewed her photography as a hysterical hobby, only to find herself in a wooden box on wheels, surrounded by people who still viewed her through the same narrow lens. The sun began to dip low, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and burnt orange as the stagecoach pulled into a way station for the night. It was a miserable collection of adobe structures huddled against a wind-scoured bluff, offering water for the horses and questionable stew for the travelers. Lydia ate quickly, ignoring the leering looks of the station master, and excused herself. She needed air that did not smell of grease and sweat. She walked around the side of the stable, aiming to check on the trunk that held her tripod and developing chemicals. The desert night was descending rapidly, the temperature dropping with a suddenness that raised gooseflesh on her arms. Voices drifted from the shadows behind the water trough. Lydia froze. She recognized the rough, gravelly tones of two men who had been riding atop the coach as guardsmen she had assumed were simple hired hands. "Crowley is getting impatient," one man growled. "He wants the tracks laid by November. That means the valley needs to be clear. The colonel will not move against the tribe without cause," a second voice replied, followed by the sound of a match being struck. "They have been quiet, too quiet. That is why we are here, you fool," the first man hissed. "Tomorrow, when we hit the Narrows at Painted Canyon, we make it look like a war party. Arrows, war whoops, the whole show. We leave a few bodies, maybe the soldier boy inside, or the old woman. Just enough to make the papers scream for blood." Lydia pressed her back against the rough adobe wall, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "And the girl?" the second man asked. "The pretty one with the camera. Collateral damage or a tragedy, doesn't matter. Once the attack happens, Barrett will have his excuse to wipe out that village, and Crowley gets his land. Now shut your mouth and get some sleep. We ride at dawn." Lydia waited until their footsteps faded before she dared to breathe. Her hands were trembling, not with the delicate vapors of a Victorian lady, but with cold, hard fear. It was a conspiracy. The attacks she had read about in the Eastern papers, the stories of savage raids that justified military expansion, how many of them had been orchestrated just like this? She hurried back to the main building, her mind racing. Who could she tell the merchant was a sycophant for Crowley? The widow and the boy were helpless. The gambler would likely sell her out for $1. That left James. She found James Wyatt on the porch, smoking a cigar. He looked up, his expression softening as he saw her. "Lydia, you look like you have seen a ghost." "James," she whispered, stepping close to him. "I need to tell you something. I heard the guards talking." James listened as she recounted the conversation, but as she spoke, she saw the curtain of skepticism fall over his eyes. When she finished, he sighed, patting her hand as one would soothe a child who had had a nightmare. "Lydia, you are tired," James said gently. "The heat plays tricks on the mind. Those men are employed by the Overland Company. They are rough, yes, but they are here to protect us. Why would they attack their own payroll?" "Because Silas Crowley pays better," she hissed, pulling her hand away. "James, you must listen to me. They plan to blame the Apaches." "The Apaches need no help in being violent," James said, his voice hardening slightly. "I know you have these romantic notions about the noble savage from your books, but out here they are a threat. Now, go to sleep. I will keep watch. You are safe with me." Lydia looked at him, really looked at him, and realized with a sinking heart that he could not hear her. His belief in the system, in the hierarchy of the army and the righteousness of expansion, was too absolute. To him, her warning was merely female hysteria brought on by the harsh environment. She went to her room, a small cell with a corn husk mattress, but she did not sleep. She spent the night checking her revolver, a small, pearl-handled thing her brother had given her, and securing her camera equipment. If trouble was coming, she would face it with her eyes open. The next morning, the coach departed before the sun had fully crested the horizon. The landscape changed as they moved deeper into the territory. The flat scrubland gave way to rising mesas of red rock that jutted into the blue sky like the ruined cathedrals of forgotten gods. The air was clearer here, thinner, and filled with a silence that felt heavy and watchful. Lydia sat with her camera case on her lap, her fingers tracing the brass latches. She watched the driver and the guard through the front window, knowing now that they were wolves in shepherd's clothing. Every jolt of the wheel felt like a countdown. Around midday, the terrain grew rugged. They were approaching the foothills that led to the Painted Canyon. To the south, the land dropped away into a vast basin of shadow and light. "Look at that," the gambler said lazily, pointing out the window. "A savage." Lydia leaned forward. On a high ridge of sandstone, perhaps 200 yards away, a solitary figure sat atop a paint horse. It was an Apache warrior. He was motionless, a part of the stone itself. He wore buckskin leggings and a shirt of calico, his dark hair held back by a strip of red cloth. Even at this distance, he exuded a power that was palpable. He was not looking at the coach in general. He seemed to be looking directly at her. Lydia felt a strange sensation wash over her, a prickling at the base of her neck that had nothing to do with fear. It was a shock of recognition. In Boston, men looked at her and saw a dowry, a hostess, a womb. This man on the ridge looked at her and seemed to assess her spirit. His gaze was fierce, unblinking, and devoid of the polite veils of civilization. It was a look of pure, unadulterated curiosity and warning. "Damn Apache scout," James muttered, reaching for the rifle he kept by his feet. "They are watching us, probably counting the rifles." "Put it down, James," Lydia said, her voice sharper than she intended. "He is just standing there." "He is waiting," James corrected her, though he did not raise the weapon. "They are like vultures. They wait for weakness." The warrior on the ridge turned his horse with a subtle shift of his weight. For a second, the sun caught the silver concho on his bridle, flashing a brilliant star of light. Then he vanished behind the rocks, disappearing as if he had been a mirage born of the heat. Lydia let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. Her heart was racing, but the rhythm was different now. It was not the cold dread of the conspiracy she had uncovered. It was something hotter, more volatile. She sat back, closing her eyes for a moment. She had told herself 1,000 times during the long train ride from the east that she was done with men. She had come here to document the iron rails and the steam engines, the conquest of nature by engineering. She wanted to be the observer, the woman behind the lens, safe in her detachment. But that single silent exchange across the desert air had shattered her detachment. She felt exposed. "Are you all right, Miss Monroe?" the boy asked timidly. Lydia opened her eyes. She looked at the boy, then at James, who was scanning the horizon with a soldier's paranoia. She looked at the two men driving the coach, who were driving them toward a trap. "I am fine," Lydia said, though she knew it was a lie. She was not fine. She was a woman alone in a land that wanted to kill her, surrounded by men who wanted to own her or silence her. She touched the cool leather of her camera case. "I will not be a victim," she promised herself. "I will not be a pawn in their game." The stagecoach rattled on, dust billowing in its wake like a long, choking tail. Ahead, the walls of the painted canyon rose up, red as dried blood, waiting to swallow them whole. Lydia Monroe checked the light coming through the window, calculating the exposure in her mind, and prepared for the violence that she knew was waiting around the bend. She did not know that the warrior on the ridge was not a vulture, as James had said, but a hawk, and that before the sun set. Her fate would be irrevocably bound to his by the ancient, unforgiving laws of the desert. The painted canyon was a gash in the earth where the sun rarely touched the bottom. The walls were sheer cliffs of red sandstone that rose like the bloodied teeth of a giant beast, narrowing until the sky was nothing more than a thin blue ribbon high above. The air here was still and suffocatingly hot, trapping the dust kicked up by the horses' hooves. Lydia sat frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the seat until her knuckles were white. This was the place, the exact place the men had described. The first shot did not sound like a gunshot. It sounded like a dry branch snapping, sharp and sudden. The driver slumped forward without a cry, the reins slipping from his lifeless fingers. The horses, sensing the lack of control and terrified by the noise, screamed and surged forward. The coach lurched violently to the left, slamming Lydia's shoulder against the wooden frame. "Ambush!" James shouted, throwing himself across the cabin to grab his rifle. "Get down, everyone! Get down!" More shots rang out, echoing off the canyon walls, amplifying the sound until it was a deafening roar. Arrows thudded into the wood of the carriage. But Lydia, even in her terror, noticed something wrong. The arrows were poorly fletched, wobbling in flight. From the rocks above, figures appeared. They were painted in garish streaks of ochre and black, wearing feathers that looked as if they had been plucked from pillows rather than earned in battle. They shouted, their voices echoing down into the gorge. "Death to the white man," one screamed in English, followed by a string of gibberish that sounded like a child mimicking a language they had never heard. "Fake," Lydia's mind screamed. "It is all a performance, but the bullets were real." The widow screamed as the glass windows shattered, spraying shards across the cabin. The merchant was huddled on the floor, weeping and clutching his valise. James leaned out of the broken window, firing back with practiced calm. "They are shooting too well for savages," he yelled over the din. "These are marksmen." The coach hit a large boulder. The world tilted. Lydia felt a sensation of weightlessness, a terrifying suspension of gravity, before the carriage slammed onto its side. Wood splintered with a sound like breaking bones. Lydia was thrown violently against the door, her head striking the metal latch. Darkness swallowed her instantly. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments of pain and confusion. There was the smell of smoke, the sound of groans. Lydia opened her eyes to see the world sideways. She crawled out through the shattered window, gasping as her bruised ribs protested. The scene was a nightmare. The coach was a wreck. The widow and the merchant were still, their bodies twisted in unnatural angles. The gambler was gone. "Lydia?" She turned to see James, his face streaked with blood and dust. He was dragging himself toward the cover of a large rock, his leg clearly broken. Behind him, a group of soldiers, a patrol that must have been trailing the coach, was covering fire, pushing back the attackers. "Run!" James shouted, pointing toward a narrow fissure in the canyon wall. "Get to the high ground. We will cover you." Lydia hesitated, looking at her camera case, which lay crushed beneath a wheel. Her evidence, her life. "Go!" James roared, firing his revolver at a figure on the ridge. Lydia scrambled up the loose shale, her skirts tearing on the thorns. She reached the fissure just as a massive explosion rocked the canyon floor. The attackers had set off dynamite. A cloud of dust and rock debris billowed up, obscuring everything. "James!" she screamed, but her voice was lost in the rumble of falling stone. The explosion had collapsed part of the canyon wall, sealing the narrow pass she had just run through. She was cut off. Below her, through the settling dust, she saw the soldiers retreating, dragging James with them. They were pulling back, leaving the wreckage behind. They must have assumed she was buried in the rockfall. She was alone. Lydia stumbled away from the canyon edge, driven by blind panic. She walked for hours, dragging herself over sharp rocks and through dry washes, desperate to put distance between herself and the men who had murdered her companions. By the time the sun began to set, the adrenaline had faded, replaced by a thirst so profound it felt like she had swallowed razor blades. She had no water, no hat. Her boots were thin leather, meant for city streets, not the unforgiving terrain of the high desert. Night fell, bringing a bitter cold that bit through her torn dress. She huddled under a mesquite bush, shivering uncontrollably. The silence of the desert was absolute, broken only by the distant yip of a coyote. She closed her eyes and saw the fake war paint, the clumsy feathers, the cold calculation in the eyes of men who were killed for a railroad contract. The next day was a blur of agony. The sun rose like a hammer, beating down on her unprotected head. Her lips cracked and bled. Her vision began to swim. She saw things that were not there. A steam engine chugging through the sagebrush, its whistle sounding like a church choir. A bustling street in New York, with vendors selling iced lemonade. She reached out for a glass, and her hand grasped only empty air and prickly pear spines. "Water," she croaked, her voice a dry rasp. "Please." She stumbled and fell, her knees hitting the hard earth. She could not get up. This was it. This was how Lydia Monroe died, not as a famous journalist, but as a pile of bleached bones in the middle of nowhere. She lay there, the heat baking her skin, waiting for the end. A shadow fell over her. She flinched, expecting a vulture, or perhaps one of Crowley's men coming to finish the job. She forced her swollen eyes open. A horse stood above her, a magnificent paint stallion with powerful muscles, and on its back sat a man. He was silhouetted against the blinding sun, a dark shape of lean strength, He held a rifle loosely in one hand, resting it across his thighs. He was looking down at her, his face unreadable in the shadow of his brow. It was the warrior from the ridge. Lydia tried to speak, but only a dry wheeze escaped her throat. She thought, "Death has come. He is beautiful." Cade Lonehawk looked down at the woman. He had been tracking the smoke from the canyon, curious about the explosion. He had found the wreck, the bodies looted by the white men who pretended to be Apache. And then he had found her tracks wandering, erratic circles that spoke of a mind lost to the sun. She looked small and broken, her yellow hair matted with dust, her skin burned angry red. She had no weapon. She was not a soldier. She was just a dying creature. His first instinct was to leave her. The white soldiers would be searching. To be found with a white woman, alive or dead, was a death sentence for an Apache. But then she looked up at him. Her eyes were blue, the color of the sky before the rain, and they held no hate, only a resigned, quiet acceptance. Cade dismounted, his movements silent. He uncorked his water skin and knelt beside her. "Drink," he said. His voice was deep, the English words rough and heavily accented. Lydia flinched as he brought the skin to her lips. She tried to gulp, but he pulled it away. "Slow," he commanded. "Drink slowly, or dessert kills you in different ways." He let a few drops fall onto her cracked tongue. It was warm and tasted of leather, but to Lydia, it was the sweetest vintage wine she had ever tasted. She sobbed, a dry, tearless sound. Cade watched her. He saw the bruises on her arms, the terror that lingered behind the exhaustion. She was a victim of her own people's violence. He suspected. The men who wore false feathers did not leave witnesses. If he left her, she would be dead by sunset. If he took her to the fort, he would be shot on sight before he could explain. He looked toward the distant mountains, where his people's camp lay hidden in a box canyon. It was a risk, a terrible risk. But the law of the desert was clear: you did not leave a life to the sand if you had the power to save it. He capped the water skin and stood. Without a word, he bent down and scooped her up. She was shockingly light, little more than hollow bones and heavy skirts. She smelled of dust and fear, but beneath that, a faint scent of lavender soap that seemed alien in this harsh place. Lydia leaned her head against his chest. She could feel the steady thud of his heart, slow and strong. His skin smelled of wood smoke and sage. It was a primal, dangerous scent. Yet she felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of safety. He placed her on the horse in front of him, his arms circling her to hold the reins. "Hold," he said. Lydia gripped the horse's mane. As they moved, her back pressed against his chest. She could feel the heat of his body, the shifting of his muscles as he guided the animal. It was an intimacy she had never known, not even in the polite ballrooms of Boston. She was in the arms of a savage, a man her society called a monster. And yet, he was the only thing keeping her from the void. They rode for hours, climbing higher into the red rocks, navigating trails that were invisible to the untrained eye. The air became cooler as they ascended. Finally, they passed through a narrow slit in the rock wall and emerged into a hidden valley. It was green, a shock of emerald in the red wasteland. A stream cut through the center, lined with cottonwood trees. Tipis were scattered across the meadow, smoke curling lazily from their tops. As they rode in, silence fell over the camp. Children stopped playing. Women looked up from their cooking fires. Men reached for their weapons. Cade rode to the center of the village and stopped before a large lodge. He slid off the horse and then reached up to help Lydia down. Her legs gave way, and he caught her, holding her upright. An old woman stepped out of the lodge. Her face was a map of wrinkles, her eyes sharp and black as obsidian. This was Atsa, the medicine woman. Beside her stood Grey Wolf, the chief, his face grim. "You bring a white woman here, Cade?" Grey Wolf asked in Apache, his voice low and dangerous. "Have you lost your mind? The bluecoats will follow her scent like hounds." "She was dying," Cade replied, keeping his arm around Lydia's waist to support her. "She is a victim of the men who wear our feathers." She knows the truth. The truth does not stop bullets. Grey Wolf spat. Turn her out. Let the desert finish what it started. No, Cade said, his voice firm. I found her. I gave her water. I brought her across the threshold of the valley. She is under my protection. A murmur went through the crowd. A young warrior, Talon, stepped forward, his face twisted in a sneer. Protection, you rode with her alone for a day and a night. You held her on your horse. You slept under the same stars. Talon turned to the elders. The old laws are clear. A man and a woman, strangers, alone in the wilderness for a night. The spirits have witnessed their union. It is a bond. If he does not claim her, he dishonors the tribe. He brings shame upon us all. Atsa stepped forward, leaning on her staff. She looked at Lydia, her gaze piercing. She saw the strength in the white woman's jaw, the fire that still burned low in her eyes despite her exhaustion. Talon speaks the truth, Atsa said, her voice raspy but carrying to every ear. The desert binds what it touches. You have shared water and breath. You have shared the journey. To cast her out now is to invite bad medicine, but she cannot stay as a stranger. Atsa turned to Cade. There are only two paths. Lone Hawk, you must marry her, bind her to you and to the tribe by blood and fire. Or you must cut her loose entirely, take her to the edge of the canyon and leave her to the spirits. There is no middle ground. Silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Lydia did not understand the words, but she understood the tone. She saw the hostility in the faces around her, the fear, and she felt the tension in the man beside her. Cade looked at the elders, then at the angry face of Talon, and finally down at Lydia. He did not want a wife, especially not a white wife who would bring danger to his door. His heart was still scarred from the loss of his family years ago. He had sworn to live only for the fight, to protect his people until the end. But as he looked at her at the sunburned nose, the cracked lips, the defiant tilt of her chin, he felt a pull he could not explain. It was not just pity. It was a recognition. She was a survivor, like him. And the thought of dragging her to the edge of the canyon and leaving her to die, he could not do it. It went against every instinct he possessed as a warrior and a man. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs with the scent of pine and impending storm. He turned his body fully toward her, blocking the hostile glares of the others. Listen to me, he said to her in English. Listen well. Lydia looked up at him, trembling. What is happening? They say I cannot keep you here as guest, Cade said, struggling to find the words. They say we were alone, in the desert. That means bond. He stepped closer. The heat radiating from him was intense. His dark eyes locked onto hers, burning with a mixture of frustration and something else, something fierce and hungry that made her breath catch. If you do not belong to me, you belong to the desert. They will make me leave you there. To die, Lydia gasped. No, please. Cade reached out and took her hand. His grip was hard, calloused, desperate. You must marry me, tribal law commands it, the Apache said, his eyes full of fierce longing. The words hung in the air between them. It was a command, a plea, and a confession all at once. The longing in his eyes was raw, a naked vulnerability that shocked her. He was terrified for her, and terrified of what he was about to do. Lydia's mind reeled. Marry him, a stranger, a savage. It was madness. It was the very thing she had run from in Boston, a marriage forced upon her by social rules. But then she remembered the thirst. She remembered the feeling of her tongue swelling in her mouth. She remembered the cold eyes of the men who had blown up the canyon. She looked at James Wyatt in her memory, the man who would have saved her only to stifle her. And then she looked at Cade, this man who had given her his water, who stood between her and a hostile tribe, who looked at her not as a doll, but as a life worth saving. Lydia's voice faltered. She looked at Atsa, who was watching with an impassive expression. She looked at Talon, who was fingering the knife at his belt. She looked back at Cade. If I say yes, I live. Yes, Cade said. You live with me. It was not a proposal of love. It was a contract of survival. But as his thumb brushed over her knuckles, she felt that electric current again, a spark that jumped from his skin to hers, waking up parts of her soul she thought had withered. "I accept," Lydia whispered. "For now." Cade nodded, a muscle jumping in his jaw. He turned to the elders and spoke a single word in Apache. "Yes." The tension in the clearing broke, replaced by a flurry of whispers. Atsa nodded once, satisfied. Talon spat on the ground and turned away. Lydia sagged against Cade, her strength finally giving out. He caught her, lifting her easily into his arms again. As he carried her toward his lodge, she realized with a terrifying clarity that she had crossed a line from which there was no return. She was no longer Lydia Monroe of Boston. She was the betrothed of a warrior, a woman of the desert, bound by a law as ancient and unforgiving as the stone beneath her feet. The ceremony was not the grand, suffocating affair of lace and organ music that Lydia Monroe had once dreaded in Boston. There were no flowers, no nervous guests whispering behind fans, and no priest droning on about obedience. Instead, there was only the smell of burning sage, the rhythmic beat of a single drum, and the terrifying, silent weight of the desert night. Atsa, the old medicine woman, moved with a surprising agility for her age. She mixed a paste of red ochre and animal fat in a small stone bowl, her eyes never leaving Lydia's face. Inside the lodge, the air was thick with smoke and expectation. Grey Wolf and a few elders sat in a semicircle, their faces carved from granite, witnessing the binding that would keep the peace between the tribe and the spirits. Lydia stood beside Cade. He felt like a wall of heat next to her. He had stripped off his calico shirt, revealing a chest and shoulders that were corded with muscle and marked by the harsh life of the frontier. Lydia felt small and pale beside him, her torn traveling dress a ridiculous remnant of a world that now seemed 1,000 miles away. Atsa stepped forward. She dipped her thumb into the red paste and drew a jagged line across Lydia's forehead, then a matching one on Cade's chest, right over his heart. She muttered words in the Apache tongue, a low chant that sounded like the wind scraping over stone. "Drink," Atsa commanded in English, holding out a gourd cup. Lydia took it, her hands trembling. She looked at Cade. His expression was unreadable, his jaw set hard. He gave a barely perceptible nod. Lydia raised the cup and drank. The liquid was thick and tasted of bitter roots and soil, burning its way down her throat like liquid fire. She coughed, gasping, and the elders made a sound that might have been approval or amusement. Cade took the cup from her and finished it in one swallow. His eyes locked on hers. Then came the binding. Atsa produced a strip of white rawhide. She took Lydia's left hand and Cade's right hand, pressing their palms together. The contrast was stark. Lydia's skin, though sunburned, looked fragile against the deep copper of his. Atsa wound the leather around their wrists, pulling it tight, knotting it with a finality that made Lydia's heart stutter. "Walk," Atsa said. They walked 4 times around the central fire pit of the lodge, east, south, west, north. With every step, Lydia felt the heavy pull of Cade's arm. He moved with a predator's grace, silent and sure, while she stumbled in her worn boots. He slowed his pace to match hers, a small mercy that she clung to. When the 4th circle was complete, Atsa cut the bond with a knife made of obsidian. "It is done," the old woman said. "The spirits see you as one breath, one fire, one path." The elders rose and filed out, leaving them alone. The silence that followed was louder than the drum. This was her husband, this stranger. Cade moved first. He went to the far side of the lodge where a pile of furs lay. He arranged them with efficient, jerky movements. Then he turned to her. The firelight cast deep shadows across his face, making him look more myth than man. "This side is yours," he said, pointing to a pile of buffalo robes on the left. "That side is mine." He pointed to the right, near the entrance. There was a good 5 feet of dirt floor between the 2 sleeping places. Lydia let out a breath she did not know she was holding. "Thank you," she whispered. Cade watched her for a moment, his gaze intense. Then, without a word, He turned his back to her and began to untie his leggings. Lydia quickly turned away. Facing the wall of the lodge, she heard the rustle of leather, the soft sound of skin against fur. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She was a married woman now, according to this law, and he had every right to demand what husbands demanded. But the silence stretched on. "You sleep," Cade said, his voice rough. "You are safe here." Lydia lay down on the furs. They were softer than she expected, smelling of smoke and pine. She kept her clothes on, curling into a tight ball. She listened to his breathing settle into a slow, rhythmic pattern. She turned her head slightly. Cade was lying on his back, staring up at the smoke hole in the roof of the lodge. In the dim light, she could see the scars on his torso. There was a jagged white line running down his ribs, and a circular pucker on his shoulder that looked like an old bullet wound. His body was a map of violence, a testament to a life of constant warfare. Suddenly, his eyes shifted, catching hers in the dark. Lydia froze, caught staring. "I won't touch you," Cade said into the darkness. The words were low, almost a growl, but there was no threat in them. "Unless you ask, you are a wife by law to save your life, not a prisoner in my bed." Lydia felt a flash of heat rise in her cheeks, but also a wave of profound relief. "I understand," she said softly. "Thank you, Cade." He grunted and rolled over, presenting his back to her. "Sleep. Tomorrow. Work begins. Nima will teach you not to be useless." The next few weeks were a brutal education. Lydia Monroe, who had once prided herself on her ability to debate philosophy and develop complex photographic plates, found herself reduced to the status of a clumsy child. Nima, a young woman with a round face and eyes that missed nothing, was her instructor. Nima spoke little English, but her sighs were a universal language of exasperation. "No, no," Nima scolded, slapping Lydia's hand lightly as she tried to shape the corn dough. "Too thick, like rock. You want to break teeth." Lydia wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of flour across her sunburned skin. "I am trying. Nima, the dough is sticky." "You have city hands," Nima said, grabbing Lydia's fingers and inspecting them. "Soft, weak, good for holding paper, bad for life." Lydia gritted her teeth and went back to the dough. She would not cry. She refused to cry. She pounded the corn mixture flat, her shoulders aching from the repetitive motion. It was not just the cooking. It was the hauling of water from the stream in heavy clay jars that bruised her hips. It was the scraping of hides, a foul-smelling task that made her retch until she learned to breathe through her mouth. It was the gathering of wood, searching for mesquite that would burn hot and clean. The village watched her. Most of the women were indifferent, treating her like a temporary curiosity. But some were hostile. Ellen, the wife of Talon, made no secret of her hatred. When Lydia walked by the communal fire, Ellen would spit on the ground. "White women bring white soldiers," Ellen hissed one afternoon as Lydia struggled to carry a basket of firewood. "She is a beacon for death. Why Cade keeps her, I do not know. Perhaps she bewitched him." Lydia kept her head down, her face burning. She wanted to scream that she did not ask to be here, that she was a victim too, but she knew words meant nothing to them. Only survival mattered. Cade was often gone during the day, hunting or patrolling the perimeter of the valley, but in the evenings, he would return, his eyes always seeking her out first. He did not say much, but he would inspect her work. One evening, he took a piece of flatbread she had made. It was slightly charred on the edges and misshapen. He took a bite, chewed slowly, and swallowed. "Better," he said simply. "Not rock today." It was a small praise, but to Lydia, it felt like a triumph. She looked at her hands. They were no longer the pale, smooth hands of a Boston lady. They were brown, calloused, with dirt ingrained in the cuticles and small burns on the knuckles. They were ugly, her mother would have said. But for the first time, Lydia felt they were useful. The heat of the late afternoon was oppressive, a physical weight that pressed down on the valley. Lydia slipped away from the camp. carrying a small bundle of yucca root soap Nima had given her. She made her way to a secluded bend in the stream, shielded by a thicket of willows. She stripped off her dusty clothes, the air hitting her skin with a welcome coolness. She waded into the water. It was cold, fed by mountain snowmelt, and it shocked the breath from her lungs. She sank down until the water reached her chin, closing her eyes and letting the current wash away the sweat and the smell of smoke. For a moment, she was just Lydia again. Not a captive, not a wife, just a woman enjoying the simple grace of water. She began to wash her hair, scrubbing her scalp vigorously. She heard a twig snap. Lydia froze, sinking lower into the water, crossing her arms over her chest. She turned her head sharply toward the bank. Cade stood there. He had a rifle in his hand, his body tense. He was not looking at her with the leering gaze of the men at the stagecoach station. He was scanning the ground and the trees. "Snake," he said, his voice flat. "Diamondback. Near your clothes. Do not move." Lydia's heart slammed against her ribs. She looked at the bank where her dress lay in a heap. Coiled near her boots was a thick, patterned snake, its rattle buzzing softly, a sound she had mistaken for the cicadas. Cade moved with terrifying speed. He did not shoot. The noise would alert the camp. Instead, he picked up a long, forked branch, pinned the snake's head to the earth, and with a swift flick of his knife, severed it. He kicked the carcass away and then straightened up. He turned to look at her, checking if she was safe. For a heartbeat, time suspended. Lydia was chest deep in the water, her wet hair slicked back, her shoulders and the curve of her upper chest visible above the surface. The water distorted the shape of her body below, but it hid nothing of her vulnerability. Cade's eyes widened slightly. He took in the wet sheen of her skin, the water droplets clinging to her eyelashes, the sudden flush that rose from her neck to her cheeks. He did not look away immediately. His gaze lingered on the curve of her throat, and Lydia felt a sudden, sharp pull in her belly, a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with fear. He was beautiful in a rugged, dangerous way. The sun caught the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the damp hair at his temples. "You are safe now," Cade said, his voice sounding deeper than usual, rough like gravel. He turned his back abruptly, facing the trees. "Get dressed. I will wait." Lydia scrambled out of the water, her hands shaking as she pulled on her clothes. She felt exposed, not just physically, but emotionally. She had seen the look in his eyes. It was not the look of a captor. It was the look of a man who saw a woman. When they walked back to the camp, the silence between them was charged, vibrating with a tension that felt like the air before a lightning strike. The hostility in the village continued to simmer. Talon and his faction grew louder in their complaints to Grey Wolf, arguing that Lydia's presence was a danger they could not afford. Lydia found solace in the unlikeliest of places, the children. It started with a game of stickball. The children were playing near the edge of the camp, shouting and laughing. The ball rolled near Lydia, where she sat mending a basket. She picked it up. A small boy, no older than 6, approached her cautiously. Lydia smiled and tossed the ball gently back to him. He caught it, surprised. "Good catch," she said. The boy giggled. Soon, other children gathered around. They were fascinated by her pale hair and her blue eyes. Lydia pulled a stick from the fire and began to draw in the dirt. She drew a steam engine. "Train," she said, pointing to the drawing. "Choo-choo." The children laughed, mimicking the sound. "Choo-choo." She drew a tall building. City. By the time Cade returned that evening, Lydia was surrounded by a dozen children, all of them listening with rapt attention as she acted out a story using hand gestures and simple words. Cade stopped and watched from the shadows. He saw the way the children leaned into her, the way her face softened when she smiled at them. He saw the way she touched a little girl's hair with a gentleness that betrayed her longing for connection. Talon walked by, scowling. "She corrupts them with white man lies. She makes them laugh." Cade replied quietly. "Laughter is not a lie." The weather turned a week later. The sky turned a sickly shade of yellow-green, and the wind began to howl like a wounded animal. A sandstorm. "Inside," Cade ordered, grabbing Lydia's arm and pulling her into the lodge. They tied down the entrance flap, plunging the interior into semi-darkness. The wind battered the leather walls, sounding as if 1,000 hands were beating against them. Sand hissed against the outside, finding every crack and crevice. The temperature dropped rapidly. The fire flickered and died, the smoke unable to escape through the vent properly. Lydia sat on her furs, shivering. The noise was terrifying, a constant, roaring scream that drowned out her thoughts. She wrapped her arms around herself, burying her face in her knees. "You are cold," Cade said. It was not a question. He moved his furs closer to the center of the lodge, away from the drafty walls. "Come here, the buffalo robe is big enough." Lydia hesitated. The line does not keep you warm," Cade said. "Come." She crawled over to him. He lifted the heavy buffalo hide, and she slipped underneath. They lay side by side, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the radiant heat of his body. The storm raged outside, but under the heavy fur. It was quiet and intimate. Lydia could hear his breathing, steady and deep. She shifted, and her shoulder brushed against his arm. He did not pull away. "Why do you hate the railroad so much?" Lydia asked into the dark, her voice barely a whisper. "Beyond the land, it feels personal." Cade was silent for a long time. She thought he would not answer. "It is not just land," he said finally. 5 winters ago, my father, my mother, my sister." Lydia held her breath. "They went to trade at the outpost. Peaceful. They had papers from the fort, but the railroad men, Crowley's men, they wanted a fight. They said my father stole cattle. It was a lie." Cade's voice remained even, which made the story more horrific. "They killed them, scalped them to sell the hair for bounty money. Then they threw the bodies on the tracks. When the train came, there was nothing left to bury." Lydia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears pricked her eyes. "Oh, Cade, I am so sorry." "Barrett knew," Cade continued. "He signed the death report. Accidental collision," he wrote. "He protected the men who did it, because Crowley pays him." He turned his head to look at her. In the gloom, his eyes were pools of ancient grief. "That is why I fight. Not because I hate progress, but because their progress is built on our bones." Lydia reached out and, without thinking, placed her hand on his chest, over the scar she had seen that first night. "They are monsters," she whispered. "Not you. They are the savages." Cade covered her hand with his own. His palm was rough, but his touch was gentle. He interlaced his fingers with hers. They lay there in the dark, hands clasped, the storm raging outside, 2 people from warring worlds finding a common language in grief. The storm passed, but the dynamic between them had shifted. They were no longer just survivors sharing a space. They were allies. And perhaps something more. A few nights later, the tribe held a dance to celebrate the end of the storm. The drums beat a rhythm that thumped in Lydia's blood. She sat near the fire, watching the dancers, a young Apache woman, beautiful and lithe, with long black hair that gleamed in the firelight, moved toward Cade. She smiled at him, a bold, inviting smile. She offered him a cup of drink, her fingers lingering on his hand longer than necessary. Lydia felt a sharp, hot twist in her stomach. It was ugly and green and undeniable. Jealousy. "Why do I care?" she thought frantically. "I am leaving. I have to leave. This is not my life." But when she looked at Cade taking the cup, she didn't see a stranger. She saw the man who had covered her in the storm. She saw the husband who had saved her life. Cade took a sip, then caught Lydia's eye across the fire. He saw the tightness in her jaw. Slowly, deliberately, he handed the cup back to the girl without drinking more, gave her a polite nod, and walked straight to Lydia. He sat down beside her, his shoulder pressing against hers. He did not say a word, but the message was clear to everyone watching, especially the girl in Talon. "I have made my choice." "You did not have to do that," Lydia murmured. looking at the fire. Do what? Cade asked innocently. She is beautiful, and she is of your world. I have a wife, Cade said. Tribal law commands it. He said the phrase they had used at the wedding, but this time there was a hint of dry humor in his tone. Lydia looked at him and saw the corner of his mouth twitch. She laughed, a soft, genuine sound. You are impossible, she said. I'm Apache, he corrected. But beneath the banter, the conflict raged in both of them. Lydia looked at the stars and wondered if she could ever truly belong here, or if she was just a pet that would eventually be discarded or killed. And Cade looked at her and wondered if keeping her was an act of love or an act of selfishness that would get them both killed. The fragile peace of their domestic life was shattered 3 days later. Lydia asked Cade to take her to the high ridge to check on the lighting for a potential photograph she wanted to take mentally. She still framed the world through a lens. Even without her camera, they rode together. Lydia now confident on a mare Cade had given her. They reached a vantage point overlooking the southern pass, the gateway to the sacred valley. Look, Cade whispered, pointing down. Far below, a group of men on horseback were moving slowly. They were pulling a wagon loaded with equipment. Brass instruments glinted in the sunlight. Surveyors, Lydia squinted. On the side of the wagon, painted in bold black letters, was a logo she recognized, the Crowley Pacific Railroad Company. They are mapping the pass, Cade said, his voice cold. They are looking for a route for the tracks. Lydia's blood ran cold. She remembered the conversation she had overheard at the way station. Cade, she said, her voice trembling. It is not just mapping. The attack on the stagecoach. The men I heard, they said they needed an excuse to clear the valley. They are not just looking for a route. They are waiting for the army to come and wipe you out so they can build over your graves. She turned to him, clutching his arm. I am the witness. I saw the fake Apache. I heard the plan. If I can prove it. Cade looked at her. Proof means nothing to Barrett. It means something to the newspapers back east, Lydia insisted. If the public knows, if the government knows it is murder for profit, not war. She stopped. She realized what she was saying. To save the valley, she would have to reveal herself. She would have to step back into the world of white men. They think you are dead, Cade said quietly. Then I will be a ghost, Lydia vowed, her eyes hardening with a resolve that matched his own. A ghost that will haunt Silas Crowley until he hangs. Cade looked at her with a mixture of pride and fear. He saw the fire in her, the same fire that had kept her alive in the desert. We go back, he said. We prepare. If war comes, we fight. But if truth can fight better, then we use truth. They turned their horses, riding back toward the village. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that looked like the bars of a cage, or perhaps the rails of a track that was coming to crush everything they had begun to build. The sickness arrived with the autumn wind, silent and insidious. It began with a dry cough among the children, then escalated to fever that burned like embers in the blood. The Apache called it the ghost sickness, a malady of the lungs that stole breath and turned skin gray. Lydia recognized the symptoms. It was not a ghost. It was influenza, or perhaps a strain of pneumonia, carried on the air from the settlements. The village was paralyzed. The traditional chants and smoke ceremonies of Atsa seemed powerless against this unseen enemy. Children lay listless on furs, their chests heaving with the effort to breathe. Lydia could not stand by and watch. She remembered her mother, a woman who had volunteered in the charity wards of Boston, and the thick medical encyclopedia that had sat on their library shelf, a book Lydia had devoured with the same hunger she had for novels. She went to Atsa's lodge. The old woman was exhausted, her hands trembling as she mixed herbs. Let me help, Lydia said, her voice firm. Atsa looked up, suspicion clouding her dark eyes. White medicine is poison. Dirt is poison, Lydia countered. She pointed to the bowl of water Atsa was using, which was murky. We need boiling water, clean clothes, and isolation. Atsa hesitated, then nodded once. Show me. For the next week, Lydia became a whirlwind of activity. She organized the women, instructing them to boil every drop of water used for drinking or washing. She showed them how to make a poultice from willow bark to reduce fever. A remedy she knew contained salicylic acid, similar to the aspirin doctors used back east. She enforced a strict quarantine, separating the sick from the healthy. "Wash your hands," she repeated endlessly, miming the action until the women understood. "After touching the sick, after touching the dead, wash." It was grueling work. She wiped fevered brows, held cups of bitter tea to cracked lips, and sang soft lullabies in English to children who were too weak to cry. One night, a little girl named Chi, whose fever had raged for 3 days, finally broke into a sweat. Her breathing eased. She opened her eyes and whispered, "Water." Lydia wept with relief. Atsa watched from the shadows. When Lydia finally sat down, exhausted, the old woman approached. She placed a hand on Lydia's shoulder, a touch that was light but heavy with meaning. "You are not just wind from the east," Atsa said, her voice raspy. "You are raining, rare rain of the desert." It was the highest praise she could give. From that day on, the hostile glares in the village lessened. Ellen still scowled, but others began to nod when Lydia passed. She had earned her place not by marriage, but by service. With acceptance came a new role. Lydia began to carry a small notebook she had fashioned from scraps of parchment and charcoal. She wrote down Apache words, phonetically capturing the guttural, musical sounds of the language: tu for water, ku for fire, gawa for home. In return, she taught the children the alphabet. They sat in a circle in the dust, tracing letters with sticks. "A is for apple," Lydia said. "Apple," they repeated, laughing at the strange sound. Lydia looked at their bright, eager faces and felt a pang of sadness. The world outside viewed them as savages, as obstacles to be removed. But here they were, hungry for knowledge, full of laughter and potential. "I will write this," she vowed to herself. "I will write about the laughter, not the war cries. I will show them as people." It was a dangerous dream, one that challenged the narrative of every newspaper in the country. But it gave her a purpose that burned brighter than her fear. One evening, after a long day of tending to the recovering patients, Lydia stumbled as she entered their lodge. Her legs simply gave way, worn down by fatigue. Cade was there in an instant. He caught her before she hit the ground, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her against him. They fell together onto the pile of buffalo robes, a tangle of limbs and breathless laughter that died abruptly as they landed. Lydia lay beneath him, her chest heaving. Cade hovered over her, his weight supported on his forearms, his face inches from hers. The air in the lodge suddenly felt very thin. She could feel the heat radiating from his chest, smell the scent of sage and leather that was uniquely him. His hair had fallen forward, curtaining them from the rest of the world. His eyes were dark, dilated, searching hers with an intensity that made her heart hammer against her ribs. "You are tired," Cade murmured, but he did not move away. "I am," Lydia whispered. Her gaze dropped to his mouth, then back to his eyes. The memory of the river, of his bare chest at the wedding, flooded her mind. The tension that had been simmering between them for weeks boiled over. "Cade," she said, her voice trembling. "If I ask, would you still not touch me?" Cade went still, a muscle feathered in his jaw. "You ask, I ask." He lowered his head, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. When she didn't, he pressed his lips to hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It was the taste of desperation and desire, of two people who lived on the edge of death claiming a moment of life. Lydia's hands tangled in his long hair, pulling him closer. Cade groaned, a low sound in his throat, and his hand swept down the curve of her spine, pressing her flush against him. His calloused fingers traced the line of her ribs through her thin cotton shirt, sending shivers of electric heat across her skin. She arched into him, a silent plea for more. The shirt bunched under his grip, wrinkling as his hand moved to cup her hip. For a moment, The world dissolved into sensation, the roughness of his hands, the softness of the fur beneath her, the hard press of his body. Then, Cade pulled back. He was breathing hard, his forehead resting against hers. His eyes were squeezed shut, as if he were in pain. "Not like this," he rasped. Lydia blinked, dazed. "Cade." He opened his eyes. They were burning, but with a fierce restraint. "Not while you still have one foot on the path out. Not while you think you might leave." He rolled away from her, sitting up and running a hand through his hair. "If we do this, it is forever. No going back to Boston. No going back to white lady life. I will not make you a widow of the spirit if you leave." Lydia lay there, her body humming with unfulfilled longing, but her mind clearing. He was right. He was protecting her, even from himself. He was offering her a choice that was absolute. "Thank you," she whispered, pulling the robe around her. But as she watched him stoke the dying fire, she knew her heart had already made its choice. The outside world would not leave them be. A few days later, a scout returned with urgent news. Bluecoats, the cavalry, were patrolling near the southern ridge. They were led by Colonel Barrett and a young officer. "James," Lydia breathed. She and Cade rode to a vantage point. Below, in the scrubland, a patrol of 10 soldiers had surrounded a young Apache boy who had been out hunting rabbits. They were shouting at him, shoving him back and forth. Lydia saw James Wyatt. He looked older, harder. He was shouting questions at the boy, who only shook his head in terror. "Where is the woman?" James yelled. "Where is the white captive?" Cade raised his rifle, his face a mask of cold fury. "I will kill them!" "No," Lydia grabbed the barrel of the gun. "If you shoot, they will bring the whole regiment. They will slaughter everyone. They are hurting him." Cade snarled. "Let me go down," Lydia said. "Let me talk to James. He thinks I am a prisoner. If he sees I am alive, if I can reason with him." Cade looked at her, fear flashing in his eyes. "He will take you. I will not let him," Lydia promised. "Trust me." Cade lowered the rifle, but his grip on it did not loosen. "I cover you. One wrong move, and the lieutenant dies." Lydia rode down the slope, emerging from the trees like an apparition. She wore her buckskin dress now, her hair braided with leather strips, the red ochre mark faint on her forehead. "James," she called out. The soldiers spun around, rifles raised. James froze. He stared at her, his mouth falling open. "Lydia," he whispered. "My God." He ran toward her, ignoring the warnings of his men. "Lydia, you are alive. We thought... the explosion." He reached for her horse's bridle, his eyes scanning her frantically. "Did they hurt you? Did they force you to wear this? This filth?" "I'm fine, James," Lydia said, keeping her voice steady. "I am not a prisoner. Let the boy go." James blinked. "Not a prisoner, Lydia. Look at you. You are dressed like a savage. They have brainwashed you. It is Stockholm Syndrome. I read about it." "Listen to me," Lydia cut him off. "The Apache did not attack the stagecoach. It was white men hired by Crowley. I heard them planning it." "I saw them." James shook his head, a pitying look on his face. "Lydia, please. You have been out in the sun too long. Crowley is a businessman. Why would he attack his own line?" "For the land," she cried. "To get the army to clear the valley, James. You are being used." James's expression hardened. "The only people using anyone are these heathens using you as a shield. Come with me, now. The colonel is waiting. We can take you home." "I'm home," Lydia said quietly. James stared at her, hurt and confusion battling in his eyes. "They have turned you. I will come back for you. Lydia, I swear it. I will save you even if you do not want to be saved." He signaled his men. They released the boy, who scrambled away into the rocks. James gave her one last, lingering look of tragic determination, then mounted his horse and led the patrol away. Lydia watched him go, her heart heavy. He was a good man, blinded by his loyalty and his prejudice. Unbeknownst to Lydia, James did not go straight back to the fort. He met Colonel Barrett and Silas Crowley at a temporary outpost near the railhead. Lydia had followed, keeping to the shadows of the rocks, with Cade silent as a ghost beside her. They crept close to the command tent, the canvas glowing with lamplight. "She is alive," James was saying, his voice distraught. "But she is confused. She claims it was white men who attacked the coach." Inside the tent, Silas Crowley chuckled. The sound was like dry leaves scraping together. "Poor girl. The savages have twisted her mind. A classic case of hysteria." "She seemed very certain," James insisted. "Colonel, if there is any truth—" "Enough, Lieutenant," Barrett barked. "Mr. Crowley is a patriot. Do not insult him with the ravings of a traumatized woman." Crowley's voice dropped lower, smooth and deadly. "It is a tragedy, really. A white woman, lost to the savages. A fate worse than death, but useful." "Useful?" James asked. "If we rescue her," Crowley said, "she is a hero, a victim. The papers will love it. But if she dies, if the Apache kill her when we try to liberate her, well, that is a martyrdom that will justify wiping every redskin from this territory to the Mexican border." Lydia clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp. "One white woman is a small price to pay for progress," Crowley concluded. "Monday. We move to the valley Monday. Make sure the press is there. Colonel?" Lydia and Cade withdrew into the darkness. They rode in silence until they were miles away. When they reached the overlook above the village, Lydia stopped her horse. She looked down at the fires flickering in the darkness, at the home she had found in the most unlikely of places. "They are going to kill me," she said, her voice hollow. "Either way, if I go back, they lock me in an asylum to shut me up. If I stay, they will kill me to start a war." Cade rode up beside her. He reached out and took her hand. "Then we give them neither." "What do you mean?" "We fight," Cade said, "but not just with arrows." They rode down into the camp. Grey Wolf and the council were waiting. When Lydia told them what she had heard, there was an uproar. "She is bait!" Talon shouted, pointing a finger at her. "She brings the wolves to our door. Kill her now and move the camp." "No!" Cade stepped in front of her. "She risked her life to warn us. She is not bait. She is one of us." Lydia stepped forward, pushing gently past Cade. She looked at Talon, then at the elders. She spoke in Apache, halting, broken but understandable. "I am the wife of Cade," she said. "My heart is here." She switched to English, her voice ringing with passion. "If I betray you, may the desert take me. I am Lydia Monroe Lone Hawk. If I must die, I die with you. But I will not let them win without a fight." Silence descended. It was the first time she had used his name. Lone Hawk. Cade looked at her. At that moment, he did not see a white woman. He saw a warrior. He saw a partner. The wall he had built around his heart crumbled completely. "We have a plan," Lydia said, turning to Cade. "The camera, the box that steals souls," Grey Wolf asked. "The box that steals truth," Lydia corrected. James said they needed a reason. "Crowley is staging another attack on Monday, on the rail line, to provoke the war." "We will be there," Cade said. "Not to kill, but to watch." "I have one glass plate left," Lydia said, patting her saddlebag where she had kept the surviving equipment wrapped in cloth. "One chance, if we can get a picture of Crowley's men, white men, dressed as Apache, attacking the train. Then the world will see," Cade finished. It was a desperate plan, a suicide mission, to sneak close enough to a staged attack to take a photograph, in broad daylight, with a camera that required seconds of stillness. "It is madness," Talon grumbled. But he did not look away. "But it is a good madness." "We ride tomorrow," Cade said. That night, there was no line between the firs. Cade pulled Lydia into his arms, holding her as if he could shield her from the coming storm with his own body. They did not make love. The air was too heavy with the scent of death for that, but they slept entangled, breathing the same air, dreaming the same dream of a freedom that might cost them everything. The smoke from the burning train cars was still visible against the pale blue sky when the news reached the valley. It traveled as news always did in the high desert, carried by the wind, by the terrified whispers of traders, and finally by the scouts who had witnessed the carnage from the ridges. "They hit the supply line at Dead Man's Curve," the scout reported, his chest heaving. "Men with painted faces, but they rode like cavalry, and they killed like butchers. 4 white workers died." The newspapers in Santa Fe are already printing the headlines. They call it the Sunday Massacre. Cade stood in the center of the council circle, his face grim. Beside him, Lydia felt a cold stone settle in her stomach. It had begun. The trap was sprung. "The blue coats are coming," Grey Wolf said, his voice heavy with the weight of 80 winters. "Colonel Barrett has received orders from Washington. Total pacification." The council erupted into chaos. Talon slammed his spear into the earth. "We fight, we make them pay for every step they take into our land. We cannot win a war against the endless numbers of the white man," another elder argued, his hands shaking. "We must run, south, to the mountains of Mexico. We can disappear before they arrive. And leave the graves of our ancestors," Talon spat. "Leave the sacred spring to be poisoned by their iron horses." Cade stood silent, caught in the rip current of the argument. He looked at his people faces he had known since birth, lined with fear and defiance. Then he looked at Lydia. She stood near the edge of the circle, pale but resolute. If they fought, she would be branded a traitor to her race. If they ran, she would die of exposure or capture on the long trek south. "There is no running," Cade said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Barrett has scouts on the southern passes. They expect us to run. They will be waiting. Then we die fighting," Talon growled. "No." Lydia stepped forward. Her voice was steady, though her hands were clenched in the folds of her skirt. "We do not die. We expose them." The council turned to her. "Barrett brings the army because he claims he is protecting civilization," Lydia said. "He brings reporters, photographers, men of influence to witness his justice. If I meet them, if I stand before them and tell the truth, with the evidence we have gathered, they will shoot you before you speak," Talon dismissed. "Not if I am standing in plain sight," Lydia countered. "Not if I am Lydia Monroe, the tragic victim they are coming to save. They cannot shoot the woman they are supposedly rescuing without destroying their own story." It was a gamble, a terrible, reckless gamble. But as Grey Wolf looked at her, he nodded slowly. "The wind shifts," he murmured. "Perhaps the white woman is the storm we need." That night, the valley was silent, a silence so deep it felt like the breath before a scream. The warriors sharpened their knives. Mothers packed meager belongings, ready to flee if the line broke, in their lodge. Cade and Lydia sat by the dying fire. The air between them was charged with the knowledge that the sun might not rise for them again. Lydia reached out and took Cade's hand. His skin was warm, his palm rough with calluses, the hand of a fighter, a survivor. Slowly, she reached for the leather band on his wrist, the one Atsa had tied during their wedding ceremony. She untied it, her fingers lingering on his pulse. From her pocket, she pulled a small silver ring. It was simple, etched with a pattern of vines. "My mother gave me this," Lydia whispered. "She said it was to remind me of where I came from, but I think it belongs here now." She pressed the ring into Cade's palm and closed his fingers over it. "I am not just playing a part tomorrow. Cade, I am not just Lydia Monroe. I am your wife." Cade looked at the ring, then at her. The fierce longing that had been in his eyes the day he saved her was there again, but now it was tempered with a profound tenderness. "You are my heart," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "If the spirits take me tomorrow, I will go without regret, because I have known you." He reached out and touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, the scattering of freckles across her nose, the peeling skin where the sun had claimed her. He kissed her forehead, then her eyelids, then her mouth. It was not a kiss of desperation this time, but of devotion. He pulled her down onto the furs. The firelight danced on the walls of the lodge, casting long, flickering shadows. Cade's hands were gentle, reverent, as if he were memorizing the map of her body. He unbuttoned her dress, his touch lingering on the softness of her skin, contrasting with his own hardness. When they finally came together, it was a slow, burning fusion. There was no hurried urgency, only a deep, rhythmic connection, a silent vow made with breath and skin. Lydia arched against him, feeling the solid weight of him, the beat of his heart against her own. In the darkness, with the threat of death waiting outside the flap of the lodge, they created a world that consisted only of each other. It was the moment the contract ended and the true marriage began. Dawn broke with the sound of bugles. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, alien and shrill. The United States cavalry had arrived. Cade stood at the entrance of the valley, hidden behind a cluster of boulders. Above him, on the high ridges, Talon and 50 warriors waited with rifles and bows, invisible against the red rock. Down on the valley floor, standing alone in the open scrubland, was Lydia. She wore a white cotton dress she had traded for weeks ago, now washed and mended, but around her neck hung a heavy turquoise necklace, and on her feet were Apache moccasins. Her hair was loose, blowing in the wind. She looked like a creature of two worlds, belonging fully to neither and both. Colonel Barrett rode at the head of the column, his uniform immaculate, his saber gleaming. Beside him rode Silas Crowley, looking like a vulture in a silk suit. Behind them were 200 soldiers, and further back, a wagon carrying a photographer and a few journalists from Santa Fe. Barrett raised his hand, halting the column 50 yards from Lydia. "Miss Monroe!" Barrett shouted, his voice booming. "Thank you, God. You are alive. Do not be afraid. We are here to rescue you." Lydia did not move. She did not run toward them. She stood her ground, her chin lifted. "I do not need rescuing, Colonel," she shouted back, her voice clear and strong. A murmur went through the soldiers. This was not the hysterical, grateful victim they expected. "She is in shock," Crowley said loudly to the journalists. "Look at her, dressed in rags. The savages have broken her mind. Step aside, Miss Monroe," Barrett commanded. "We have orders to clear this nest of vipers." Lydia took a step forward. "There are no vipers here, Colonel, only families. The only vipers are the ones standing beside you." She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a sheaf of papers and the glass plate negative she had taken days before. "I have proof, Colonel, proof that the attack on the train was staged, proof that Mr. Crowley hired mercenaries to kill his own workers to start this war." Crowley's face went purple. "Lies. The woman is mad." "I have the sworn testimony of a soldier," Lydia yelled, pointing at the ranks. "Private Miller, step forward." A young soldier in the second row shifted uneasily. He looked at Lydia, then at Barrett. He opened his mouth to speak. "Silence," Barrett roared, drawing his revolver. "This is a trap. She is luring us in fire at will." "No." James Wyatt spurred his horse forward from the flank. "Sir, you cannot fire on a civilian. You cannot fire on a woman." "She is a traitor!" Barrett screamed. He leveled his gun at Lydia. The crack of a rifle shot split the air. It did not come from Barrett. It came from the ridge. Barrett's hat flew off his head, spun by a bullet that missed his skull by an inch. "Ambush!" a sergeant screamed. The valley erupted. From the cliffs, arrows and bullets rained down. The soldiers scrambled for cover, their horses rearing in panic. The discipline of the column shattered. Cade broke from his cover, leading a charge of 20 warriors on horseback. They hit the flank of the soldiers like a thunderbolt, screaming war cries that curdled the blood. Lydia stood frozen for a second as bullets kicked up dust around her. Then she moved, not running away, but running toward a fallen soldier, dragging him behind a rock. "Stay down!" she screamed at the terrified journalists who had leaped from their wagon. "Get your heads down!" The battle was a chaotic swirl of dust, smoke, and noise. The Apache had the high ground and the element of surprise, but the soldiers had numbers and discipline. Cade fought with a cold, terrifying precision. He rode through the melee, his rifle barking, then swinging it like a club when the chamber was empty. He was cutting a path toward the command group toward Crowley. Lydia saw him. She saw the desperation in his movement. He was not fighting to win. He was fighting to end it. Crowley, seeing the tide turning into a bloody stalemate, tried to turn his horse and flee, but the canyon entrance was blocked by fighting. He spurred his horse toward the only open ground, the steep trail leading up the western cliff face. Cade saw him go. He wheeled his paint horse and gave chase. "Cade!" Lydia screamed, but her voice was lost in the din. She grabbed a discarded rifle. She didn't know how to use it well, but she knew she couldn't just watch. She ran toward the cliff, dodging horses and men, high above on the trail. Crowley's horse stumbled. He abandoned the animal and began to climb on foot, scrambling over the loose shale. Cade leaped from his horse and followed, moving with the agility of a mountain cat. They met on a narrow ledge, hundreds of feet above the valley floor. Crowley pulled a derringer from his vest. He fired. Cade jerked back, clutching his side. Blood blossomed dark against his buckskin shirt. He fell to one knee. Crowley laughed. A breathless, hysterical sound. "You filthy animal, you think you can stop progress, I will pave over your bones." He aimed the gun for a killing shot, but Cade was not done. With a roar that seemed to come from the earth itself, he lunged. He ignored the gun, ignored the pain. He tackled Crowley, slamming him against the rock wall. The gun skittered over the edge. The two men grappled, a deadly dance on the precipice. Crowley clawed at Cade's wound, digging his thumbs in. Cade gritted his teeth, his vision graying, but he did not let go. He forced Crowley back, inch by inch. Crowley's heel caught on a loose stone. He slipped. For a second, Cade held him by the lapels of his expensive suit. Crowley looked into the eyes of the man whose family he had murdered, and he saw no mercy, only a grim justice. "For the valley!" Cade rasped. He let go. Crowley screamed, a long, thinning sound that ended abruptly with a sickening thud far below. Cade swayed. His legs gave out. He collapsed onto the ledge, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Below, the fighting had stopped. The sight of the financier falling to his death, combined with James Wyatt turning his own weapon on Barrett to stop the slaughter, had broken the will of the attackers. "Cease fire!" James bellowed, riding into the center of the killing field. "Barrett is under arrest! Lay down your weapons!" Lydia did not wait. She scrambled up the trail, tearing her dress, her hands bleeding on the sharp rocks. "Cade!" She found him lying on his side, his face pale as ash. The blood was pooling beneath him, soaking into the red dust. "Cade," she sobbed, falling to her knees beside him. She pressed her hands against the wound, trying to staunch the flow. "Stay with me. Do not you dare leave me." Cade opened his eyes. They were unfocused, glassy. He looked at her, and a faint smile touched his lips. "Lydia," he whispered. Did we win?" "We won!" she cried, tears streaming down her face, mixing with the dust. "Crowley is gone. The soldiers are stopping. You won." "Good," he breathed. "The sun is bright." No, Lydia begged. Look at me. Husband." He focused on her face with effort. "If this is my last dawn, I regret nothing. Marrying you was the only law I gladly obeyed. Don't you say goodbye," Lydia commanded, her voice breaking. "Tribal law commands you to stay. You hear me, you must stay." He closed his eyes, his chest rising and falling with agonizing slowness. "Help!" Lydia screamed to the valley below. "Help him!" Steps thundered on the trail. It was Atsa, moving faster than seemed possible, followed by James and two soldiers carrying a stretcher. "Move, girl!" Atsa ordered. Pushing Lydia's hands aside, she packed the wound with moss and bound it tight with strips of cloth. "He is strong, but the spirit is wandering. We must call it back." They carried him down the mountain, a solemn procession amidst the settling dust of battle. Lydia held his hand the entire way, her grip iron tight, willing her own life force into him. The battle for the valley was over, but the battle for Cade's life had just begun. The dust in the valley had settled, but the scent of blood and gunpowder lingered in the still air, a grim perfume of survival. The sun hung low and heavy, casting long, bruised shadows across the broken earth. Lydia sat near the entrance of the healing lodge, wiping her hands on a cloth that was already stained dark. Cade was alive. His breathing was shallow, his body feverish as he fought the infection from the bullet wound. But Atsa said his spirit had decided to stay. That was enough for now. But the price of their victory lay in rows beneath the cottonwood trees. 5 warriors had fallen. Among them was Talon. He had been shot defending the pass where the women and children were hidden. When Lydia had found him, his life was ebbing away into the red dirt. He had looked up at her, his eyes losing their fierce hostility. "You fought," he had rasped, blood bubbling at the corner of his lips. "For us, like one of us. Rest now, Talon," Lydia had whispered, holding his hand until the grip went slack. Across the clearing, the bodies of 6 young soldiers were being wrapped in canvas by their surviving comrades. They were boys, really farm boys from Ohio or Pennsylvania who had come west for adventure and found only death in a canyon they could not name. Lydia looked from the wrapped bodies of the Apache to the wrapped bodies of the soldiers. It was a tragedy of such senseless magnitude that she felt a physical ache in her chest. All of this because one man wanted to lay iron tracks a few months faster. The funeral for the Apache warriors began at dusk. It was not a somber, silent affair like the burials Lydia knew. It was a ceremony of wailing songs that rose to the stars, of drums that beat like a second heart for the earth. Lydia stood beside Grey Wolf as the bodies were placed in a deep crevice in the rocks, covered with stones to keep the coyotes away. Personal items were buried with them: a favorite bow, a pouch of tobacco, a child's toy for a fallen father. "They do not leave us," Grey Wolf said softly to the gathered tribe. "They become the wind in the canyon. They become the hawk watching from the ridge. We are not fewer today. We are just changed." Lydia wept, not silently, but openly, her tears mixing with the soot on her face. She was mourning not just the dead, but the innocence that had been stripped from the valley forever. 2 days later, the reckoning came for the living. A military inquiry team arrived from Santa Fe, escorted by a fresh troop of cavalry. But the mood was different this time. There was no bluster, no aggression. The photographs Lydia had taken, miraculously preserved in the chaos, had been developed. The image of white mercenaries painting their faces before the attack was blurry, but undeniable. Colonel Barrett was stripped of his command in front of his own men. He stood stiff and silent as his epaulets were removed, his face a mask of humiliated rage. He was to be taken to Fort Union for a court-martial. James Wyatt stood by Lydia near the command tent. He looked exhausted, his uniform dusty, his eyes haunted. He had spent the last 48 hours writing a report that would destroy his superior officer and likely end his own career advancement. "I'm sorry, Lydia," James said, looking at the ground. I was so sure I was on the right side. I thought I was protecting you." We both had to unlearn things. "James," Lydia said gently, "I came here thinking I could capture this world in a box and take it home. You came thinking you could tame it with a rule book. We were both wrong." James looked up at her. He saw the changes in her, the strength in her stance, the depth in her eyes. She was no longer the girl he had courted in Boston parlors. She was a woman forged by fire. "What will you do?" he asked. "The government. They are sending a new agent, Mr. Sterling. He is a bureaucrat, not a soldier. But his offer—" Lydia nodded. She knew the offer. Mr. Sterling was a man with soft hands and a voice like dry parchment. He sat in the council lodge, sweating in the heat, and laid out the terms of peace. "The government acknowledges the irregularities caused by Colonel Barrett and Mr. Crowley," Sterling said, adjusting his spectacles. "However, the railroad must go through. It is a matter of national interest." He pushed a map forward. We have designated a reservation. It is 50 miles north. Safe, protected. The tribe will move there. You will be given rations, blankets, and tools for farming. That is Rockland, Grey Wolf said, his voice trembling with age and anger. Nothing grows there. It is a prison without walls. It is the best we can offer, Sterling said with a shrug. The alternative is difficult. The army cannot guarantee your safety if you remain here. Then Sterling turned to Lydia. As for you, Miss Monroe, you are to be returned to civilization. We have a carriage ready to take you to Santa Fe and then a train ticket to Boston. Your family has been notified. You will be received as a hero, a survivor of a terrible ordeal. The silence in the lodge was suffocating. Lydia looked at Cade, who was sitting up for the first time, his side heavily bandaged. His face was pale, his eyes dark shadows. And if I stay? Lydia asked. Sterling blinked. Stay. My dear woman, that is impossible. You cannot live on a reservation. It is illegal for a white citizen to reside there without a special permit, which you will not get, and you certainly cannot stay out here. You would be a fugitive. The meeting ended without a decision. The tribe was given 3 days to decide. That night, the camp was divided. We must go to the reservation. A mother wept, clutching her baby. At least there will be no shooting. We can survive. We will starve slowly instead of dying quickly, another warrior argued. Lydia and Cade sat away from the fire, under the vast canopy of stars. You should go, Cade said. His voice was rough, pain etched into every syllable. Go back to Boston. Write your stories. Use your camera. You can fight for us from there. With paper and ink. Lydia looked at him. Is that what you want? Cade did not answer immediately. He looked at her hands, those battered, strong hands that had saved his life. He looked at her mouth, which he had kissed with such desperation. I want you to live, he said. On the reservation, it will be hard, ugly. I do not want to watch your spirit wither in the dust. I do not want you to hate me one day because I kept you in a cage. And if I leave, Lydia said softly, will your spirit survive? Cade closed his eyes. A tremor went through his shoulders. I will be a husk, he admitted, his voice barely audible. But a husk that knows you are safe. Lydia reached out and touched his cheek. I am not safe without you. Cade, my soul is not safe in a Boston parlor. I tried that life. It was a slow death of a different kind. She took a deep breath. There is a third way. Cade opened his eyes. We do not go to the reservation, Lydia said, her voice gaining strength. And we do not go back to Boston. We go south, Mexico. Near the border, Lydia said. The old trade routes. There are places there where the map is blurry. Places where the army does not go, and the Mexican government does not care. We take who wants to come the orphans, Atza, Nima, the ones who cannot bear the cage. We start over. Cade stared at her. It was madness. It meant giving up their ancestral home, walking into the unknown, living as outcasts forever. It will be hard, he said. We have survived hard, Lydia replied. We survived the desert. We survived Crowley. We can survive a new beginning. The next morning, the tribe split. It was a tearful, heart-wrenching separation. Grey Wolf, too old to travel further, decided to lead the majority to the reservation, hoping to preserve what he could of their traditions within the white man's boundaries. Go with the wind, Grey Wolf told Cade, placing a hand on his shoulder. Keep the fire burning where they cannot find it. Cade, Lydia, Atza, Nima, and a group of about 20 others, mostly young warriors and those with nothing left to lose, packed their horses. They took only what they could carry. James Wyatt met them at the edge of the valley before dawn. He had a pack horse with him. I should arrest you, James said, but his hand was nowhere near his gun. Sterling thinks you are leaving for Santa Fe in the morning. He handed Lydia the reins of the pack horse. There are 3 Henry rifles in there, ammunition, some dried beef, and a map that shows the water holes in the Badlands south of here. Lydia took the reins. Tears pricked her eyes. Thank you, James. Write the truth. Lydia, James said. Wherever you end up, send it to the papers. I will make sure they print it. The world needs to know. He looked at Cade. The two men, soldier and warrior, former enemies, nodded to each other, a silent accord of respect. Ride fast, James said. I will delay the pursuit as long as I can. The journey south was a grueling test of endurance. They moved through the Badlands, a landscape of twisted rock and scorching heat that seemed designed to kill. But this time, Lydia was not the helpless victim strapped to a saddle. She rode at the front with Cade. She scouted for water. She helped hunt for lizards and rabbits when the food ran low. Her skin turned a deep bronze, her hair bleached almost white by the sun. She was lean, hard, and alive in a way she had never been before. At night, under the shelter of rocky overhangs, she and Cade shared a single blanket. They spoke of the future in hushed tones. We need a place near the crossing, Lydia said, tracing a line in the dirt. Where the traders go between Tucson and Sonora. We can trade goods. We can get news. And the children? Cade asked, looking at the sleeping orphans wrapped in blankets nearby. We teach them, Lydia said firmly. We teach them to read, to write, to know the laws of the white man so they can fight them in court, not just on the battlefield. And we teach them the old ways, so they never forget who they are. A school, Cade mused. In the middle of nowhere. A home, Lydia corrected. Somewhere, after 3 weeks of travel, they found it. It was a box canyon near the border, hidden from the main trail but accessible if you knew where to look. A spring bubbled up from the rock, feeding a grove of mesquite and cottonwood. There was flat land for planting corn. It was wild, harsh, and beautiful. They named it Lone Hawk Crossing. The first year was a battle for survival. They built cabins from felled logs and adobe mud. They planted corn and beans, praying for rain. They hunted in the mountains. Lydia hung a wooden sign over the largest cabin Lone Hawk Crossing trading post school. Slowly, hesitantly, people began to come. First, it was Mexican traders, grateful for a place to water their mules. Then, Apache families who had fled the reservation, hearing whispers of a safe haven. Then, drifters, white men and women who had found no place in the civilized world and sought a life without judgment. It became a community of outcasts, a found family bound not by blood, but by the shared desire to live free. Lydia sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was cooling, smelling of rain and sage. She rested a hand on her stomach, which was just beginning to swell with new life. Cade came up the steps, wiping dust from his face. He had been helping build a corral for the wild mustangs they had caught. He looked tired, but his eyes were bright, the shadows of the past finally receding. He sat down beside her, leaning back against the rough wood wall. He reached out and covered her hand on her belly. He kicks today? Cade asked softly. She, Lydia corrected with a smile. And yes, she is restless. She wants to run before she is born. Cade chuckled, a low, warm sound that vibrated against her side. She will be in trouble, like her mother. I am not trouble, Lydia protested, leaning her head on his shoulder. I am persistent. Trouble, Cade insisted. The first word will be trouble, because that is what you brought to my life. Beautiful, terrible trouble. Lydia laughed and playfully knocked her knuckles against his head. And you love it. Cade turned his head and kissed her. It was a slow, deep kiss, tasting of the day's work and the evening's peace. It was the kiss of a man who had everything he needed right here, in this dusty corner of the world. I love you, he whispered against her lips. They sat there as the stars came out, watching the lights of the other cabins flicker on in the valley below. They were far from the world they had known, far from the ballrooms of Boston and the warpaths of the past. But they had built something new, something real. They had built a bridge between worlds, and they were standing on it together, holding hands as the desert night wrapped them in its cool, dark embrace. Mama, Papa, watch me. The high, clear voice sliced through the dusty afternoon air, joyous and demanding. Lydia turned from the wooden railing of the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Down in the hard-packed earth of the yard, a little girl of 5 years was running. She was a creature of wind and sunlight, her skin the color of warm honey, her hair a chaotic tumble of black curls that glinted with copper in the sun. She wore a simple calico dress that was already dusted with red clay at the hem, and she ran barefoot, her feet toughened by the earth. Ilara. They had named her for a star, but she belonged entirely to the ground. Cade Lone Hawk stood by the corral fence, a coil of rope in his hand. He was older now. There were threads of silver at his temples, weaving through the black hair like veins of quartz and obsidian. His face was lined by the sun and the weight of leadership, but his body was still lean and hard, moving with the easy grace of a man who knew his place in the world. He dropped the rope and knelt, opening his arms just in time to catch the projectile that was his daughter. Ilara slammed into his chest, giggling, and he swung her up into the air, her laughter echoing off the canyon walls. "You run like a jackrabbit," Cade told her, his voice rumbling with a tenderness that still caught Lydia by surprise. Even after 5 years, too fast for the coyotes. "Too fast for you, Papa," Ilara crowed, grabbing his ears. Lydia watched them, a profound sense of peace settling in her chest. She is 30 years old now. The pale, fragile girl from Boston was gone, burned away by the desert sun. In her place was a woman with sun-streaked hair, strong arms, and eyes that had seen death and chosen life. She wore a simple dress of blue cotton, but around her neck hung a heavy silver amulet with a turquoise stone, the protection of the Apache spirits. Lone Hawk Crossing had grown. It was no longer just a hideout, it was a sanctuary. Behind the main cabin stood a long, low building made of adobe bricks. Laughter and the murmur of voices drifted from its open windows. This was the school. It was the heart of their new life. Inside the cool, dim interior of the schoolhouse, the air smelled of chalk dust and dried sage. Lydia walked in, her boots clicking softly on the floorboards. The students were a motley collection that would have made a Boston headmaster faint. There were Apache children who had fled the reservation with their families, their eyes dark and watchful. There were Mexican children from the border towns, barefoot and eager. There were 3 white children, sons and daughters of drift miners who had settled near the creek, looking for a life that didn't involve digging for gold that wasn't there. Atsa sat in a rocking chair in the corner. The medicine woman was frail now, her skin like crumpled parchment, but her mind was as sharp as a skinning knife. "And then," Atsa croaked, holding up a gnarled finger, "Coyote stole the fire from the fire beings. Because the people were cold, he burned his tail, which is why the tip is black to this day." The children leaned forward, captivated. "Did it hurt?" a freckle-faced boy named Tom asked. "Change always hurts," Atsa said, her black eyes flicking to Lydia. "But without fire, we freeze. Without change, we die." Lydia smiled and stepped forward to the blackboard. "Thank you, Grandmother Atsa." She picked up a piece of chalk. "Now, who can tell me the word for fire in Spanish and in English?" "Fuego," shouted a little girl named Maria. "Fire," yelled an Apache boy named Ka. "Good," Lydia said, writing the words down. She pulled out a map. She had drawn a map of the territory, but one that showed the rivers and mountains by their native names as well as their English ones. "This land has many names," Lydia told them. "Just like we do. To understand a person, you must know the name they call themselves, not just the name you give them." Outside, through the window, she could see Nima teaching the older girls how to weave baskets from yucca fibers. Nima was a mother herself now, stern but patient. They were teaching these children to survive in 2 worlds, to read the law books that could steal their land, and to read the clouds that promised rain. It was hard work. They were always short on supplies. The government ignored them, which was a blessing. But it meant they survived on trade and grit. Yet, looking at the faces in the classroom, Lydia knew they were building something stronger than a railroad. They were building a future. A week later, A rider appeared on the northern trail. He was not a soldier, which was the first sign of change. He carried a leather satchel stamped with the seal of the Overland Mail. Cade met him at the perimeter, rifle held loosely but ready. Old habits died hard. But the rider merely tipped his hat and handed over a bundle of newspapers and a letter sealed with wax. "For Mrs. Lone Hawk," the rider said, "or Miss Monroe, depending on who was asking." Lydia took the papers on the porch that evening. Cade sat on the railing, whittling a toy horse for Alara. She unfolded the first newspaper. It was a copy of the New York Times, dated 2 months prior. The headline made her breath catch. "The Bridge Between Worlds: A White Woman's Life Among the Apache," by James Wyatt. James had kept his promise. He had left the Army 2 years ago and became a correspondent. The article was not a sensational piece about a captive. It was a thoughtful, nuanced account of the Apache culture, of the injustices of the reservation system, and of a woman who had chosen love over prejudice. "He writes well," Lydia said, her voice thick. "He calls us a model for the future." Cade grunted, but he leaned in to look at the paper. "He admits the Army was wrong. That is unexpected. Listen to this," Lydia read aloud. "We have sought to conquer the West with rifles and rails, but perhaps true conquest is the conquest of our own hatred. In a hidden valley near the border, a school stands as a testament that different blood does not mean different hearts." Cade was silent for a long moment. "Words are wind, but sometimes the wind brings rain." Lydia opened the letter. It was on heavy, expensive stationery. "It is from the Department of the Interior," she said, scanning the lines, "and a Society for Indian Education Reform." She looked up at Cade, her eyes wide. "They want us to come north, to Santa Fe, to speak." Cade stopped whittling. "To speak." "They want to know about the school," Lydia said. "They say the reservation schools are failing. The children are dying of sadness and sickness. They want to know how our children are. Thriving." She read the last paragraph. "They also offer a legal dispensation. If we come, they will have a judge officiate our marriage under United States law. They will issue a birth certificate for Alara. She would be a citizen, an heir." The offer hung in the air like smoke. It was the late harvest of their struggle. The society that had tried to kill them was now, cautiously, asking for their help. But the choice was not simple. That night, after Alara was asleep, the argument was a quiet, intense murmur in the dark. "It is a trap," Cade said, pacing the small room. "They want to parade you, the white woman who tamed the savage. They will turn me into a pet and you into a saint. I am neither." "It is not about us," Lydia argued, sitting on the edge of the bed. "It is about the school. If we have their support, we can get books, medicine. We can protect this land legally, so no one can ever drive us out again. And if we go back," Cade said, turning to her, his eyes full of the old fear, "will you remember how much you missed that world? The silk dresses, the tea parties. Will you look at me and see only dust and scars?" Lydia stood up and crossed the room. She took his face in her hands. The skin was rough, warm, and beloved. "Look at me, Cade," she commanded. "I see the man who gave me water when I was dying. I see the man who defied his own tribe to save me. I see the father of my child." She kissed his palm. "I do not want their world, but I want to use their power to protect ours. We go, we speak, we get the papers for Alara, and then we come home." Cade searched her eyes, looking for any hesitation. He found none. "We come home," he repeated. It was a vow. They traveled to Santa Fe in the spring. It was strange to be back in a city of stone buildings and paved streets. Lydia wore a dress of green silk that felt heavy and constricting after years of cotton and buckskin. Cade wore a suit, which he hated, but he wore it with a dignity that made the local politicians look small and soft. They stood before a crowded hall. Lydia spoke of the Apache not as enemies, but as families. She spoke of the desert not as a wasteland, but as a garden that required different eyes to see. She showed them photographs not of war parties, but of mothers nursing babies, of old men planting corn, of children laughing in her schoolroom. The audience was silent. For the first time, they saw the enemy as human. When the judge married them in a civil ceremony the next day, it was a quiet affair. James Wyatt was there as a witness, smiling with a mixture of pride and melancholy. "You did it, Lydia," James said afterwards, shaking Cade's hand. "You changed the story." "We just lived it," Cade said. They did not stay. Despite the invitations to dinners, despite the offers of patronage, they packed their wagon 3 days later. The city felt like a corset too tight, too breathless. They yearned for the vast, open lungs of the desert. On the journey back, they stopped at a high overlook. Below them, a train snaked its way across the landscape. Lydia stood on the edge of the cliff, the wind whipping her hair. She remembered the terror of that first stagecoach ride, the sound of the explosion, the feeling of being a pawn in a game of giants. Now, the train looked small. It was just a machine of iron and steam, traversing a land that was older and stronger than it would ever be. "It does not look like a monster anymore," Lydia said. "It is just a tool," Cade agreed, standing beside her. "Like a rifle or a camera. It depends on whose hand holds it." He put his arm around her waist. "Are you sorry that we left the city?" Lydia leaned back against him. "The city has walls. Here, I can breathe." She looked out at the horizon, where the purple mountains met the sky. "The desert was a harsh teacher, Cade. It took everything I thought I was and burned it to ash, but it gave me the truth in return." They returned to Lone Hawk Crossing as the sun was setting, painting the valley in shades of gold and violet. Alara ran out to meet them, followed by Nima and the dogs. The smell of roasting meat and wood smoke welcomed them, the perfume of home. That night, the celebration was simple. A fire was lit. A guitar was played. The community they had built, this family of survivors, gathered around. Later, when the moon was high and white like a bone in the sky, Lydia and Cade sat on the porch of their cabin. The valley was quiet, save for the chirp of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. They sat on a blanket, Lydia resting between Cade's legs, her back against his chest. His arms were wrapped around her, his chin resting on her shoulder. "She is asleep," Lydia whispered, tilting her head toward the open door where Alara lay dreaming. "She dreams of running," Cade murmured. Her legs were twitching. He moved his hand to stroke Lydia's hair, his fingers tangling in the long strands. He pressed a kiss to the sensitive spot just below her ear, sending a shiver down her spine. "And our other children?" Lydia asked softly. "The ones in the school?" "They dream of tomorrow," Cade said, "because you gave them one." He turned her face toward him. In the moonlight, his eyes were no longer fierce with longing, but deep with a peace that they had fought for in blood and tears. "I love you, Lydia Monroe Lone Hawk," he whispered. "More than the rain." Lydia smiled, tears stinging her eyes. "And I love you, Cade, more than the dawn." He kissed her, then a slow, lingering kiss that tasted of the years they had shared. His hand slid down her back, tracing the curve of her spine through the thin cotton of her nightdress. It was a touch of possession and surrender, a silent language they had perfected in the dark of many nights. They did not need to speak of the dangers that still lurked, or the battles that might come as the world changed around them. They had this. They had the fire in the hearth, the child in the bed, and the vast, unbreaking silence of the desert around them. Lydia looked up at the stars, millions of them scattered across the velvet dark. She had come west running from a life that had been chosen for her. She had been captured by a law that commanded her to marry a stranger. But in the crucible of the canyon, in the shadow of death, she had found the only freedom that mattered. She understood now that freedom was not the absence of bindings. It was the choice of which bindings to accept. She had chosen him. He had chosen her. And together, they had woven a new law, not of tribe or government, but of the heart. The fire in the stove crackled, a warm, steady heartbeat. From the village below came the faint rhythm of a drum, beating in time with the earth. Lydia closed her eyes, held safe in the arms of her husband, two souls bound together under the endless, watching sky of the American West. Thank you so much for listening to the story. You must marry me, tribal law commands it. I hope you enjoyed this journey of love, survival, and the wild spirit of the frontier. Please take a moment to scroll down and leave a comment. I would love to know where in the world you are listening from. It is amazing to see how stories connect us across oceans and borders. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales. Hit that like button and give the video a hype to help this story reach more listeners. Your support means the world to me and helps keep these campfire stories burning bright. Thank you, and happy trails.